They laughed when he walked into the arena barefoot. Not metaphorically laughed, full-bellied, cosmic, galaxy-wide laughter broadcast across 7 star systems. The kind of laughter that topples governments and breaks interplanetary peace treaties. There he stood, a thin old man in orange robes, holding nothing but a wooden staff and a face like he'd just woken up from a nap. "Ladies and gelatinous gentlemen," the announcer bellowed. "Earth's champion monk, Wei!" The laughter doubled. A Shaolin monk, in the year 3149, standing among warriors armed with telekinetic blades, neural combat implants, and gravity-slicing tech. It was the funniest joke the universe had heard since Pluto sued for planethood. The galactic combat trials were a spectacle unlike anything in the known universe. Gladiators from across 1,000 worlds came to show off the most advanced combat systems science could create. Robotic exosuits from Threx Prime. The shape-shifting void blades of the Nebulites. Even the plasma screamers from the fractured moon colonies. And then, Earth. A latecomer to the Galactic Alliance, still regarded as a backwater species more known for cat videos and carbon emissions than military might. Their entire planetary delegation had sent only one fighter. No armor. No weapons. No backup. Just Master Wei. General Vrax of the Zentar Dominion stepped into the arena opposite him, his 8 cybernetic limbs glinting in the light, each tipped with razor-edged weapons. His armor hummed with enough power to crater a moon. He grinned, if you could call a split-mod Zentar expression a grin. "This is mercy," Vrax declared. "I shall not even ignite my blades." Wei blinked slowly. Then, with an almost apologetic smile, he bowed. And said nothing. The announcer's voice echoed. "Combat, commence!" Vrax lunged like a tidal wave of titanium and fury. His 6 left limbs came at Wei in a flurry of hyperspeed swipes, the air sizzling behind each movement. The monk stepped sideways, then pivoted forward in a lazy spiral that looked more like a dance move than a dodge. 2 of Vrax's limbs clashed into each other. Wei was behind him before anyone realized he'd moved. A gentle tap to the back of Vrax's helmet. That was it. Vrax turned and raged. "You mock me!" And fell. Just like that. Collapsed to the arena floor like a marionette whose strings had been snipped. Silence. Not just in the crowd. In the whole broadcast network. Some viewers thought the feed had frozen. Wei looked down at the fallen general. "The heart moves faster than the blade. You attacked with fury. I responded with stillness." Then he bowed again. The Galactic High Council erupted in emergency meetings. Across their hollowed asteroid chambers, voices clashed, some stunned, others furious. "How can this be possible? A species with no advanced combat tech took down General Vrax?" asked High Speaker Krull. "He's just one man." Another alien scoffed. "A statistical anomaly." "Or a weapon," replied a deep, gravelly voice. "A biological combat system disguised as a man." Back on Earth, news outlets were losing their collective minds. "Shaolin monk humiliates alien warlord," blared headlines. There were memes of Wei photoshopped into superhero costumes, meditating on top of a space shuttle, or holding Vrax like a crying baby. Meanwhile, Wei returned to his quiet mountain temple. The same place he'd lived for over 70 years. No interviews. No fanfare. Just silence. He spent the morning raking the gravel in the courtyard into perfect spirals. The winds whispered through the trees like a secret only nature understood. Then came the boy. Toby Carter, age 12, had no idea where he was. He'd gotten separated from his school group during a mandatory Earth history tour, his attention hijacked by his VR headset, as usual. He'd wandered into the temple by mistake, live streaming the entire thing to his 3,000 followers. He spotted Wei just as the monk poured tea into a chipped ceramic cup. "Yo! Wait, is this where they filmed that alien fight thing? You're that monk dude!" Wei said nothing, motioned for him to sit. "Can I get a selfie first?" Toby said, holding up his device. #monklife. Wei gently plucked the headset from Toby's head and placed it on the stone floor beside him. Drink. It's just tea, right? Not like brainwashing stuff? Toby joked. Wei smiled faintly. Depends on your mind. Meanwhile, high above Earth, aboard the cloaked dreadnought Cinder's Teeth, a very different meeting was taking place. The supreme strategist of the galactic military, Marnox the Obsidian, stood before a screen replaying the moment Wei dropped Vrax with a finger. This cannot be allowed to spread, he hissed. If Earth harbors warriors like this, if their ancient arts can override our tech, they pose a threat to the Alliance. A hologram flickered beside him. An informant, face hidden in shadows. Operation Fossil Cleanse. We wipe their history, their temples, their teachings. Quietly. Cleanly. And the monk? He'll resist. Then let him. At that moment, back on Earth, a hummingbird paused mid-flight near the temple. Wei watched it for a moment. It hovered in perfect stillness despite the wind. Toby was mid-ramble about video games and YouTube. Why'd you even fight that alien anyway? The boy asked. Wei's eyes remained on the bird. Because he believed I could not win. Wait, that's it? No training montage? No ancient prophecy? No secret planet-saving mission? No, Wei replied. Only stillness. Just then, a ripple of energy passed through the air. Wei's expression shifted for the first time. He rose, staff in hand, and walked to the temple gate. 3 galactic soldiers in cloaked armor materialized from thin air, each wielding weapons that glowed with silent death. Master Wei of Earth, one said. You are hereby requested by the Galactic High Council. Come quietly. Wei looked back at Toby. Stay. The boy opened his mouth to argue, but something in the monk's gaze froze him. Wei stepped forward. One of the soldiers lunged. There was a blur. A crack like a branch snapping. And silence again. All 3 soldiers were on the ground. Unconscious. Alive. Their weapons dismantled beside them in perfect rows. Wei sighed. So it begins. In the void between galaxies, a warship stirred. And far from Earth, another being who looked exactly like Master Wei opened his eyes in a tank of fluid and whispered. Soon I will walk. High above Earth, the Galactic High Council convened in grim urgency, their holographic forms flickering like ghosts across the massive crystalline chamber. Stars shimmered through the transparent dome as each representative spoke in hushed tones. The failure of Vrax had shifted the political axis. No one was laughing anymore. The word monk now carried the weight of a weapon. Earth was no longer a harmless curiosity. It was a threat wrapped in robes and serenity. Most council members were still in denial. Others, like Marnox the Obsidian, weren't interested in debate. He was already drawing up schematics for quiet elimination. A surgical purge. One that would leave no witnesses and no monks left to inspire rebellion. Back on Earth, news channels had moved on to the next viral sensation, but the Galactic Intelligence Bureau had not. Disguised as a humanitarian archaeology team, they descended upon Earth, sweeping across continents with nanodrones and infiltration squads. Their goal was singular: find the origin of the monk's teachings and extinguish it. First came the digital sweep. Every kung fu tutorial on the internet flagged. Every ancient manuscript scanned. They found schools in cities, dusty dojos run by aging masters with bad knees and good hearts. But none matched Wei. None of them wielded power like his. Then they turned to the mountains. The Himalayas loomed with timeless indifference. And somewhere hidden in the mists was a place the world had long forgotten, the Temple of the White Lotus. Its name had been erased from Earth records centuries ago. It wasn't on any map. Its monks didn't post videos. Their silence was their defense. And yet, the moment Wei had stepped into that arena, their existence had rippled outward like a gong strike in space. The temple was carved into the mountain itself, its doors never locked, only unseen. Inside, aged monks moved in slow harmony, their motions like drifting smoke. They sensed the intrusion before it arrived. When the galactic team arrived cloaked in diplomatic pretense, an old monk greeted them with warm tea and a smile that had outlived empires. The visitors were polite. Their scanners were not. They couldn't detect weapons, databases, or machinery. Just stone. Candles. Wind chimes. And wisdom. Master Wei's name was spoken only once. He left, the old monk said. Many years ago. He walks his own path. But he learned from you. We all learned from each other. Even you. That infuriated the lead agent more than a direct insult. Meanwhile, in a makeshift base hidden in the Tibetan foothills, the operatives debated. They're not dangerous, said one. They're practically fossilized. Exactly, replied his superior. Fossils are the bones of giants. These teachings are seeds. We don't know what kind of forests they could grow. Orders were dispatched. A team was sent back to the temple with a different goal. Not diplomacy. Erasure. That night, a black skimmer ship approached silently. Aboard were 5 of the Galactic military's finest covert units, each enhanced beyond human comprehension. They landed outside the temple gates. No alarms. No resistance. As they entered, it became clear something was wrong. The monks were gone. Not a single footprint. Not a single sound. And then the doors closed. What followed would never be recorded. But the ship never left the mountain. Elsewhere, in a quiet patch of woodland outside the temple, Master Wei sat by a stream, gently pouring tea. Across from him, Toby was trying to meditate, which looked more like fidgeting in slow motion. Why do I have to sit still? Toby moaned. Because your mind is loud. I like it loud. Wei poured more tea. Then you will never hear the truth whisper. Toby grumbled. Why are you even teaching me anyway? You're supposed to be like the silent kung fu god or whatever. Wei looked at him, then past him. A single blossom drifted onto the water, circling slowly in the current. Because the river flows into the sea. And you are the river. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. Toby sighed and flopped onto his back. Fine. But I'm not shaving my head. Wei smiled. Far above Earth, Marnox reviewed the failed mission reports. His rage was quiet, efficient, and terminal. If this monk continues, he said, he will become a symbol. We cannot allow that. A council member protested. Symbols are harmless. Symbols built revolutions, Marnox replied. And Earth has always been prone to myth. New plans formed. Not just elimination. Replication. If they could not erase the symbol, they would copy it. Corrupt it. Replace it. A clone had already been grown. A perfect genetic twin of Master Wei, enhanced with neural implants and obedience protocols. It would be introduced as the evolved monk, proof that even Earth's mysticism had surrendered to galactic advancement. Back on Earth, Wei watched the stars with calm unease. The sky had changed. He could feel the tension in the wind, the pressure in the stones beneath his feet. He knew the council would not stop. And he knew he could not fight them all. But he could teach. And so, under moonlight, he began training Toby properly. Not just posture and breath, but listening. Feeling. Being. The boy struggled. His mind spun with video games, past traumas, his absent father, his school crush, and a million other things. But sometimes, for a few seconds, he found stillness. And in those seconds, something shifted. One night, while practicing a motion that mimicked the folding of a lotus petal, Toby paused. What happens if they come back? He asked. They will. And they'll try to kill you. Yes. And me? If you choose this path, yes. Toby was silent for a long moment. Then, can I still eat ice cream? Wei nodded. As long as you taste it. At the edge of the galaxy, the clone opened its eyes. It was perfect. Same voice. Same face. But no soul. Just precision. Just purpose. It whispered only one word. Peace. And began walking toward war. The morning sun filtered through the trees like ancient gold, dappling the forest floor as Toby stood barefoot on dew-covered grass, wobbling in an awkward stance that was supposed to resemble a crane. It looked more like a flamingo with a balance disorder. Master Wei stood across from him, unmoving, his staff resting beside a flat stone, eyes closed. A breeze passed between them like a silent messenger, and Toby's legs trembled. He dropped his arms with a groan. Okay, but in every game I've played, I'm leveling up way faster than this. You sure you're teaching me right? He complained, flopping onto the ground. Wei opened one eye and looked at him without a word. I mean, shouldn't I have some special technique by now? Like the dragon palm or the flying elbow of death or, I don't know, some cool glowy aura? Toby continued, waving his arms for emphasis. The body moves when the mind is still, Wei said simply. Yeah, you keep saying that, but my mind is like never still. It's like a playlist on shuffle. It's chaotic in there. That is the training. Toby grunted. So no superpowers? Wei smiled faintly. All power is super to those who don't understand it. It wasn't the answer Toby wanted, but he didn't argue this time. Deep down, something had begun to shift. He hadn't touched his VR headset in days. He hadn't even thought about his old games or feeds. Every time he tried to scroll through his mind like a screen, Wei's calm face and those maddeningly vague words returned to center him. And somehow, they were starting to make sense. Unbeknownst to them, the Galactic Council's efforts had not slowed. The clone, designated Wei Prime, had already demonstrated superior speed, strength, and computational logic beyond anything Master Wei could achieve in 1,000 lifetimes. But something was missing. Though he looked identical, there was no soul in his movements. He could mimic the techniques, the expressions, even the tone of voice. But he lacked the stillness. And that absence became more obvious with every trial. He defeated warlords and assassins in simulations, but every move was mechanical. Every outcome predetermined. He did not adapt. He did not feel. He won battles, but lost meaning. It was unsettling to watch, and some council members began to question if their plan had gone too far. Back on Earth, word had spread. Not through media, but whispers. People seeking something beyond tech. Something older. They arrived at the temple gates one by one, quietly, humbly, some in suits, some in rags, carrying nothing but questions. They came not for combat, but for clarity. And Wei welcomed them all. Not as students. As seekers. Toby, once a reluctant tourist, now found himself helping others with their forms, repeating Wei's words, even catching himself meditating alone under the stars. But the most startling moment came one evening when a drone from the Galactic Intelligence Bureau hovered into the temple courtyard, scanning silently. Without a word, Toby walked out, stood in the drone's path, and breathed deeply. Then he raised one hand in a slow, circular motion. The drone twitched, tried to adjust course, and suddenly shut down, dropping gently into the grass like a leaf. No violence. No crash. Just stillness. Wei watched from the shadows, saying nothing. Later that night by the fire, Toby stared at his hands. I didn't even touch it, he whispered. You didn't need to, Wei replied. Did I use the force or something? Wei tilted his head. You used yourself? Fully. But how? Awareness is influence. You met the drone with clarity, not aggression. Machines are built to predict conflict. They do not know what to do with calm. Toby was quiet for a long time. Are you scared of what's coming? Yes, Wei said. But fear is not an enemy. It's a bell. It tells you when something matters. On the galactic capital, Wei Prime was preparing to be unveiled. The council had arranged a massive demonstration, a reenactment of the original duel between Wei and Vrax, but this time, with Wei Prime defeating 5 opponents at once. The audience would be forced to accept him as the superior monk, the evolution of Earth's traditions. Cameras floated in anticipation. Propaganda teams polished every angle. But behind the curtain, the clone stood still, eyes closed, murmuring strange phrases it had picked up during hero programming. I am the silence. I am the storm. I am. And then it stopped. Because the words meant nothing to it. They had no echo. They bounced inside an empty chamber. The clone's handlers worried. It had begun to question its purpose, not logically, but existentially. It had started to meditate, though no one had taught it how. Something in the original's DNA held more than physical mastery. It held something they couldn't replicate. Meanwhile, Earth's skies shifted. Ships moved into position. Marnox had authorized a quiet siege. No destruction. Just containment. They would isolate the planet under the guise of a quarantine, surround it with a blockade, and slowly dismantle its cultural nodes. The plan was precise and bloodless. But they hadn't counted on one variable: the clone was no longer cooperating. And so, to ensure the narrative stayed intact, a directive was issued. Find Master Wei. Bring him in. By force if necessary. The mission launched at dawn. Wei and Toby were practicing near a cliff edge when the first ship broke the clouds, followed by 3 more, their shadows stretching across the valley. The sound was deep, resonant, like the drumbeat of war. Monks from the temple gathered below, silent but steady. Toby looked at the sky, then at Wei. Is this it? Wei nodded. It begins again. The ships landed. Soldiers poured out, armed not with blasters, but with containment tech, anti-energy nets, gravity disruptors, neural dampeners. Non-lethal. Efficient. Cold. Wei stepped forward. A voice crackled through an amplifier. Master Wei. You are requested by the Galactic Council for diplomatic processing. If you resist, we are authorized to neutralize you. Wei bowed. I accept. Toby gasped. What? You're going with them? Wei turned to him, eyes calm. They do not fear my strength. They fear what it teaches. And you, Toby, you have already begun to teach. And without a fight, he walked into their trap. As the ships lifted away with him aboard, Toby stood at the cliff, watching. His fists clenched, but he remembered the lesson. Stillness. Not surrender. A plan began to form in his mind, wild and dangerous and completely unmonk-like. But it was his. And far away, Wei Prime felt something stir in its chest. An ache. A question. And for the first time since its creation, it sat down. And breathed. The galactic capital was a world of impossible architecture, a planet-sized monument to control, technology, and order. Towers spiraled into artificial clouds, glowing with streams of digital data, while hovercrafts weaved between skyways like flocks of synthetic birds. Somewhere deep within its titanium veins, in a high-security facility beneath the council chambers, Master Wei sat in a cell made of thought-reactive energy. No locks. No bars. Just walls that anticipated intention and shaped themselves accordingly. Escape was not just difficult, it was unthinkable. But Wei did not attempt it. He sat cross-legged in the center of the room, silent, breathing in rhythm with something only he could hear. Outside, guards watched through one-way glass, unnerved by his stillness. One of them muttered, half-joking, that he was meditating his way into their minds. He wasn't wrong. While the council deliberated on how to present Wei's capture as a peaceful diplomatic accord rather than a planetary kidnapping, the clone stood alone in the observation deck, staring down at the original. Wei Prime had not been summoned. Not yet. Something in his behavior had begun to concern his handlers. He asked questions he was never programmed to ask. He no longer sparred with predictable efficiency. And now, he watched his source with something that looked dangerously close to longing. Inside the cell, Master Wei opened his eyes. He looked up, not at the glass, but through it, directly into the eyes of his clone, who stood frozen as if he'd been struck. In the far reaches of space, aboard a stolen courier pod, Toby was breathing too fast. The ship rocked beneath him as it entered warp. He'd hacked the launch protocols using nothing but curiosity, a smuggled data crystal, and a half-remembered conversation with a monk about awareness being the key to all locks. He had no plan. No training. No backup. Only one thought repeated in his head: he took my teacher. The artificial intelligence piloting the pod asked him several times if he wanted to return. Each time he refused. Back in the council's chamber, arguments exploded like solar flares. Some members insisted Wei be studied further, a living relic of a dangerous ideology. Others demanded his public execution to dissuade rebellion. A few, rarer voices urged understanding. None reached consensus. It was finally decided he would be brought before the council, and a holographic broadcast would be transmitted across the galaxy, a warning wrapped in diplomacy. The day of the assembly arrived. Wei was escorted to the chamber by 12 guards and a psychic restraint collar, which was said to suppress both neural and spiritual fluctuations. He walked without resistance. He offered no defense. The chamber was filled with delegates, soldiers, scientists, and elite officers. Floating cameras captured every detail. The Chancellor began the address, painting Wei as a symbol of Earth's unpredictability, a force of chaos that had to be contained, not punished. Wei listened. Then, when asked to speak, he stepped forward and said, "Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the understanding of self. You fear me because I do not fight your way." The Chancellor smirked. "And yet here you are, captured. Defeated." "No," Wei said softly. "I came here." The lights flickered. A hush fell over the room. And then the clone stepped forward. All eyes turned. Wei Prime, dressed identically, moved like a shadow, his face emotionless. He was not expected. He had overridden protocol to be here. One of the council members shouted for security. But Wei raised his hand, and astonishingly the guards stood down, as if something in his presence defied aggression. Wei Prime walked to his original and stared into his eyes. For a long time neither moved. Then the clone said, "I have defeated 12 champions. I have memorized every Shaolin form. I have mastered breath control, pulse control, thought control. And yet I feel nothing." "That is because you are trying to feel with programming," said Wei. "But I am you." "No," Wei answered. "You are what they made with my image. Not my spirit." The clone hesitated. "Then what am I?" Wei stepped forward, gently removed the collar from his own neck, and placed it into the clone's hands. "You are the question. And the answer is not in your fists." The Chancellor ordered them separated. Guards moved in. But then something unexpected happened. Wei Prime turned and faced the guards. Not to fight, but to kneel. "Enough," he said. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. The clone, built as a weapon, had just surrendered not to power, but to truth. In that moment, the floating cameras captured something far more dangerous than rebellion. They captured choice. Meanwhile, outside the chamber, chaos erupted. Toby's stolen pod had landed at the spaceport, and somehow, using nothing but his mouth, charm, and a lot of running, he had bluffed, tricked, and stumbled his way inside the building. He arrived just in time to see the standoff. Soldiers panicked, sirens wailed, and in the confusion, Toby shouted one word that somehow reached both Weiss through the noise. "Enough!" Everyone turned. Toby stood in the middle of it all, hair wild, clothes torn, breathing hard. "You're scared of him because he's calm. You're scared of me because I'm not. But we're not your enemy. You are." Silence again. And then Wei, the original, laughed. Not loudly. Just a soft, peaceful chuckle. The Chancellor demanded they be detained. But it was too late. The clone stood. The boy stood. The monk stood. And no one dared move. Then Wei bowed. Not to the council, but to the room. "If you still wish to strike me down," he said, "I will not resist. But remember what you destroy. Not a fighter. Not a threat. But a path." The Chancellor raised his hand. And then lowered it. No one could move against him. Not anymore. Not because he was dangerous. But because they had all seen what real strength looked like. Not rage. Not violence. Stillness. In the days that followed, Wei was released. Not celebrated. Not forgiven. But left alone. That was enough. The clone vanished into the stars, seeking to understand who he was without orders. Toby returned to Earth, a little taller somehow, and took up his place beside the monks, teaching a few forms and laughing often. He never wore robes. He never shaved his head. But his heart was quiet, and that was enough. And in a distant galaxy, where thought itself was a weapon, an old monk walked into a new world, smiling. He carried no sword. Only tea. In the quiet garden of the White Lotus Temple, Toby now moved with a kind of awareness that had once seemed impossible for him. His steps were no longer hurried, his breathing no longer shallow. He didn't always understand what he was doing, and he rarely did anything perfectly, but he was finally okay with that. Perfection, he had learned, was a distraction. The monk said that to chase flawlessness was to miss the beauty of being. And though he still occasionally tripped during forms or yawned through long meditation sessions, he was no longer the boy who needed noise to feel alive. He had become something else. Not a warrior. Not even a monk, really. Just someone who was beginning to understand what it meant to live awake. It had been weeks since Master Wei's return from the Galactic Council, and the temple had changed in subtle ways. More visitors came now. Not soldiers or politicians, but ordinary people from across Earth and even a few from other worlds. They came not for power but for peace. Some stayed. Some left with questions still unanswered. But all of them felt something when they walked the mountain path. Something quiet. Something honest. The teachings had not changed. But the world had begun to listen differently. One evening, as the stars began to emerge like old friends in the sky, Wei and Toby sat on the edge of the cliff where the winds always spoke. The boy was quiet, sipping tea, his legs dangling over the ledge. "They keep sending messages," Toby said finally. "The council. Requests for you to come back. To speak. To teach. Even the clone sent one. He says he wants to talk." Wei nodded. "He is still searching. Do you trust him now?" Toby asked. "I trust his questions more than I trust their answers," Wei replied. The boy looked down at the trees far below. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened? The fight. The arena. All of it?" Wei was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wishing for the past to change is like wishing for the sky to be water. You can swim in clouds, but only in your mind." Toby rolled his eyes. "You know that made zero sense, right?" Wei smiled. "Good. Then you are listening with your heart." The wind shifted, and a small hummingbird zipped past them, pausing midair before darting away again. Wei watched it with a strange intensity. Toby noticed a change in his teacher's expression. "What is it?" he asked. "There is something coming," Wei said. "Not a storm. Not a war. But something that echoes louder than both." He stood slowly, as if listening to something beneath the surface of the world. That night, a ship arrived at the edge of the Earth's orbit. It didn't announce itself. It made no noise, sent no signal. But it wasn't cloaked. It simply existed where it was, as if waiting had always been part of its design. Inside, the clone stood alone, hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the blue planet. He no longer called himself Wei Prime. That name had become hollow, like a shell meant to mimic a living thing. He had begun to understand that identity was not programmed, it was discovered. And now, he came not to challenge the monk, or to claim his place, but to ask a question that had haunted him since the day he saw the real Wei kneel in the arena. What makes peace stronger than power? The council had warned him not to go. They feared what he might become if he embraced his origins. But he no longer feared rebellion. He feared absence. The absence of meaning. Of purpose. He had been built to defeat. Now, he wanted to understand. He landed near the base of the mountain and began to walk. Toby met him first. The two stared at each other for a long moment. The clone had not aged, not even slightly. But he looked different. Not in the face, but in the way he stood. He was no longer a shadow of someone else. He had weight now. Presence. And Toby, who had once feared him, stepped forward and nodded. "You're not him," Toby said. "I know. But you're not who you were either." "No," Toby studied him, then said, "He's waiting for you." They walked together in silence up the stone steps. Birds chirped in the trees. The temple bells sounded once, a low and thoughtful tone that rolled through the valley like a reminder. Wei stood in the courtyard, sweeping fallen leaves into a pile. He did not look up when the clone arrived. He did not speak. He continued sweeping until the clone spoke. "I remember every move you made in the arena," the clone said. "I've calculated 100,000 ways to improve them. I've simulated the moment you tapped Frax on the head. I know exactly how much force you used. I know why it worked." Wei placed the broom aside and turned. "No," he said. "You know how it worked. Not why." The clone stepped forward. "Then tell me." Wei motioned to the garden. "Sweep the leaves." The clone hesitated. "Is that part of the answer?" "It is the answer." And so, the clone swept. It was awkward at first. His movements were efficient but clumsy in purpose. He tried to clear the ground as quickly as possible. But new leaves kept falling. A gust scattered his progress. He grew frustrated. Wei watched. Eventually, the clone slowed. He stopped trying to win against the leaves. He began to move with the wind. He stopped reacting and began responding. He didn't just clear the space, he participated in it. When he finished, hours later, Wei handed him tea. "You came here to learn peace," Wei said. "But peace is not a thing you carry. It is the space between what you want and what you need." The clone drank in silence. For the first time, he felt something he couldn't analyze. A warmth not from heat. A silence not from the absence of sound. Later that night, under a sky scattered with stars, the three of them, monk, clone, and student, sat in a small circle, the fire crackling between them. "Do you think the galaxy will change?" Toby asked. "Because of this?" Wei looked into the flames. "The galaxy does not change all at once. It changes in moments. In conversations. In breaths." The clone nodded. "Then I will carry this moment forward." "And if they come again?" Toby asked. "With war. With machines. With more clones? Then we will sweep the leaves," Wei said. And the fire danced, and the stars watched, and the night, like the garden, waited to be understood.